Hey, I'm Roy Harmon, and this is the Hot Pursuit podcast. Today, we're here with Jari Bolander, who is a man of many talents. I would probably have to do a whole separate podcast just devoted to introducing him if I were going to really do him justice. But for today, I'll just tell you he is the author of Story Driven Outreach. And today, we're going to cover a lot of ground. This is going to be really good for anybody who hates the sound of crickets. If you're sending out emails, whether you're looking for investment, you're trying to score an interview, you need to reach out to somebody, a lead. Jari knows what you need to do to actually get people to pay attention. So, Jari, could you tell us a little bit about the book and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, sure. And Roy, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure having you on my show, the Entrepreneur Ethos podcast, which, you know, being a podcaster is one of those things where it's one, a labor of love, but also just so rewarding to getting to talk to great people. And then I get to talk to you again, which is just so cool. So, yeah, story driven outreach. How did that all work? Well, what's interesting is that I've written before that one, I don't know, like 5 or 6 books. And they did okay. I wouldn't say they were like breaking any records or anything like that, but I literally wrote books I wanted to read, which startup entrepreneurs are always like, hey, scratch your own itch, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting is that doesn't sell books. What sells books is writing what other people want to read. So I did a little different take on story driven outreach. I had actually did a class for a bunch of authors, no less, and talking to them about outreach and how to scale outreach. Because one of the things that authors hate, most authors, I think, no, I would say every author hates to promote themselves. There's a rare author that's like, yeah, the best part about being a writer is going on all these shows and saying how cool I am. I mean, you'd think, right? They can write books. You'd think they'd be able to write, outreach or like no, they're horrible at it. In fact, most authors that are kind of there's the 1% that are different than this that are have mainstream publishers or whatever. But if you're like every other, Tom, Dick, Jane, Harry, Harriet kind of thing, you got to promote yourself, right? So I did this thing that's with She Writes Press, Spark Press, which is actually the publisher of my new book coming out in September. And I don't know, like 100 people showed up, and I'm like, wow, like people really are interested in this. And so one of the things that I realized was like, well, wow, I should write something down, and started to sort of think about it. And then what happened was part of the part of the class was I showed people how to use this tool called Respana. And Respana is just an absolute fantastic software tool, SaaS tool for outreach at scale, getting links and just getting on interviews, all these great things, right? The Farzad, who's the founder or the co-producer or whatever he calls himself nowadays. Um, Cole, his employee, one of the persons that worked for him, Vlad, cold emailed me about Respana, and it was such a good cold email. And I get pitched, I don't know, probably like you, at least 10 times a day. I get some cold or more, or crappy ones on LinkedIn, or, it's just horrible, right? I mean, I'm sure you've had that um, problem as well. It's like, did anyone
Yeah.
teach you how to write an email?
It's and ChatGPT have made it any better.
No, honestly, I think it makes it worse, right? It's like, oh, crap at scale. Yay,
Yeah.
garbage in, garbage out. I think we all know this, right? But so I know I was like working with Respano. It was one of the first folks on the platform. And Farzad's asking me, hey, how's our tool work? And what are some of the things that you've done to get these cool, before Respana and after Respana? And started doing some research and doing some case studies. And I found out that the methodology I was using roughly 3x response rates from just baseline, right? And I did some research. It's all in the book too, which, I try to be very data driven with these things.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, wow, I mean, that's pretty amazing. And Farzad over at Respondent, they send out a lot of emails. He confirmed, yeah, this seems about what we see too when it's done right. So, inspired by a bunch of authors that hate to do outreach, me, who is my job is to cold email, and the ridiculously poor amount of emails that I get, cold emails I get a day, I decided to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak, and I wrote Story Driven Outreach. And it's an ebook you can get on Amazon. It's a quick read. Go through just some pretty basics of storytelling. How to use that to do good outreach, how to do sequences, how to follow up. It's just was a real, like, I literally did this every day and decided, what, I should teach people how to do this, not because I want to get myself out of a job. I mean, it's not the funnest part of being, an entrepreneur or whatever, but I just really wanted to make people realize that automation's great, but the fundamentals matter more than that. You have to know how to feed the machine, any machine, if it's a Respond tool, if it's ChatGPT, anything. If you don't understand the inputs and then what you should expect on the output, you're just going to spin your wheels constantly. And that actually led to me thinking more and more about how we would do all this, and me actually creating something called Get Story Driven, which I'm working on right now, which is going to kind of be the place that has all these story driven type approaches, even enhanced with ChatGPT and generative AI. But what I found fundamentally is that you need to understand how to tell a good story. And that not a lot of people know how to do. So there you go.
And why would you say that's so important when it comes to outreach? There's so many books these days that talk about the importance of story, whether it's for fiction writers or people who are out there trying, the story brand idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what you've done is really unique in applying that to outreach. So
Mm-hmm.
what is the importance there, and what are the things that people should be thinking about to develop a story that really takes advantage of that?
Yeah, I mean, first off, Story Brand, um, this is Don Miller, fantastic. Highly recommend. The book is great. I've seen him speak a bunch of times. He gets it at a level that's just amazing, right? So I love what he does. The business of story. There's a lot of them out there. I think what people need to understand, and this is specific for B2B storytelling, right? What I've found is that a lot of folks are really good at B2C storytelling, the consumer, get in the
Mhm.
consumer's head or whatever, but lack the B2B storytelling frameworks. And what's interesting is that they're the same basic storytelling tenets, because we're all got stories in our DNA. I mean, you and I are talking to each other because our ancestors told a better story. I mean, clearly, right? How to find food, how to mate. I mean, like, don't go over there. There's saber-toothed tigers and stuff,
Right.
right? Because stories were important. That's how we taught each other. That's how we entertained each other. That's how we told the lore. I mean, best story wins, essentially, right? And we're all proof of that. So what I've found is that there is so much noise out there. There's so much generic storytelling. There's so much like pedestrian stuff where people just, hey, here are these templates. I'm just going to copy a bunch of templates and insert topic here or whatever. And that's fine if you understand what you're talking about. And I think fundamentally is people don't take the step back. They don't like go to step zero. They don't say, what is this thing? And why does it matter? And so when I start out with this storytelling stuff, it's always first step is what's the big idea? What are you trying to communicate? Why does it matter? Why is it unique? And what pain are you solving? And no machine will ever tell you that. Is you need to understand that. And the reason why that's so important is because most of the time, this generic storytelling stuff is not authentic. And we're really good at sniffing out BS as humans. We're really good at it. Like, I mean, how many of the cold emails that you got this morning where you're like, the first sentence is, I know you're busy. Let's just get to the chase. You're like, really? You know, why is this thing a page long? You copied it from a template. Like, that's not, I'm going to go hit delete. I mean, again, this was this morning. I had 6 cold emails. Every single one of them started off with some silly thing like that. And they were like a page long. They were wanting me to do a bunch of stuff. They had all these links. I'm like, I got 5 seconds, maybe 3 seconds to peruse this and say if I'm interested. And if it starts out with, you know, hey team,
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that I'm from blah blah blah. Like, no, 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 it's about you. It's not about me, right? Um, I mean, your email to me was pretty good. I mean, we know each other, so it's different, but it's still a. What did we interview each other like a year? I interviewed you like a year ago, maybe.
Whew, yeah, it's been a while. It was
It's been
back during the pandemic, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but it was a very so. This is the thing. I already know you, so you already get above a level. But it was a thoughtful email, like, and he was still semi cold, right? Just so you know. The Now that's not obviously better, right? But the ones that I get, that the cold ones I get that are really good, like the one from Vlad and Respana and a couple other ones. They're short. They only make me think about one thing. They make it a little about me. The Vlad email is classic one. He's like, I really love what you're doing. It was for my blog. I really love what
Mhm.
you're doing over at the Daily MBA. This article is just awesome. I'd love to share a link, or hey, how about, I'd love to share a link with you or whatever. And the funny thing about that was, he's in his signature, it says, I'm with Respana, and it's like, what did he say? Less spam, more relationships. And I was just intrigued by that. So I emailed him back. I said, what's this responded thing? And he's like, oh, never thought about pitching you that. But like, the whole build relationships, not spam, as a metaphor for this is very important. Um, you need to be authentic. You need to, like, not waste people's time. It's going to help your delivery of your email if it's not full of buzzwords, if it's not, generic. I mean, there's generic, and then there's crafted, and then there's like personal. Like, you have to get the balance right. But at scale, you can do a lot of things to make it, oh, you actually thought about it. So I think, in that fun, and getting back to why story is important, if you don't know your own story, and if you just can't, like, that 10-second pitch, like what we do, if you just don't feel that, it's going to come through as, what are you talking about? And that story helps you target who you're talking to. You just don't want to spray and pray, right? I mean, you could, it doesn't work. One of the reasons why the you know the method I have can get, up to actually more than 3x response rates, is because we work really hard on catering the message to the person and segmenting in a way that's like, yeah, the higher the probability. You have to do your homework. This is not, it's hard. You gotta do some work, right?
It seems like there's a bit of a balancing act you have to do, because on the one hand, you say that whoever has the best story wins, but on the other hand, you've said it is a numbers game, and you do have to get out there. So you have to find a way to efficiently get that story out there. And what do you recommend for people to make sure that they're able to really do that in a way that's personal and really gets that message across?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and generally, I've asked people that do this for a living too, so we're in general agreement, that if you're doing cold email prospecting, or your segmenting list or whatever. It's usually better to start off with small lists that are targeted. So anywhere from, each campaign's anywhere from 1 to 3 to 500 names to start. Now, there are some schools of thought that'll be like, well, heck, if you have a really good, ideal customer profile and you've got 10,000 emails, then you can just go ahead and do it. That's a different, that's a more advanced level because there's other techniques that really matter at that point, like deliverability and other things, right? But if you're just sort of experimenting with this and you're like, hey, I want to do some outreach, I want to see where I'm at, I want to understand how this works, the smaller the segment size, the smaller the list or the smaller the campaign size, the better. And I generally like to start off with 250 to 300 because that's a decent number. And I think the other thing that people get all bent out of shape about this whole idea of A/B testing, which I think doesn't work at these levels, you really should never A/B test on lists that small. In fact, I would argue you probably should never A/B test. You should probably just run campaigns and see how they work across all of your campaigns, not just this one and this one. Because statistically, you want to know the distribution of whatever you're measuring over multiple runs, right? So I'm not a big fan of A/B testing that way. But it really starts with segmentation. It really starts with ideal customer profile. If you're in the B2B space and you're doing account-based marketing, super important to kind of get that right. But then, again, like what story am I telling these 300 people? Like if it's, financial, if it's Milwaukee-based financial advisors is an example. I don't know how many are in Milwaukee, but there's probably a couple hundred. I should probably know a little bit about Milwaukee. I should probably try to be a little like something that's going to be relevant. It's going to stand out. And again, it's going to take a little longer. You're going to probably have to think about it for more than 5 minutes. But once you've done this enough, you sort of understand that that matters more than the scale initially, because you're trying to find the story that resonates with your audience, and you do. And if anyone says they can figure that out on their first try, I just don't believe them. It's super hard.
Well, and it makes sense to me, especially like you said in the B2B space where it's so much more relational. It's not transactional. Whereas if you're doing something, selling a product, it's B2C, sure, blast it out to a million people. You just want them to buy one thing and not care about your brand and you never see them again, whatever. But if you actually are trying to create a long-term business relationship, this is that first impression and you want to make a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. That was such an astute observation. B2B is different than B2C. And even like B2C, A/B testing, tweaking stuff, because the goal is they're different goals, right? A B2C campaign that you're trying to get clicks and get people to, add to a cart, right? Which again, that's a numbers game as well. It's a different sales cycle and customer journey than a B2B customer journey, where depending on how much it costs, you've got a buying committee, you've got, all sorts of things. You got to, they're going to look you up. There's probably an approval process. Now, of course, if it's 99, $100 or 1,000, anyone can put a credit card down, it's a little different, but still fundamentally any kind of B2B scale is going to require multiple people. They're looking to solve a problem, and it's not an emotional buy. It's hardly ever a emotional buy in the sense of like an ad hoc, like kind of like you get an ad for something cool and you're like, I'll just buy it, right? It's not like a spur of the moment type of thing. It's usually, oh, I have a problem I got to solve, or so everything is still emotional, right? The B2B process and the B2C process, but boy, B2B is just a whole different animal with multiple people you got to worry about. So
So what does a good story look like? Just and I don't know, maybe you give us an example, maybe you tell us your story,
Sure.
or if there's a little, some little, you talked about a framework. What does a good story look like?
Well, I mean, all stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which I know sounds like, oh, duh. But some people don't have all three, right? So, fundamental three-act structure, right? The first part is what's called the beginning hook. So, the hook has to want you to go to the next phase of the story, right? So, usually the hook of a story is very emotional. There is some emotion I'm trying to invoke within you that you literally say, "Oh, tell me more about this. I'm interested." And story is also about change. So no good story ever had anything where just two guys sitting around on a podcast talking about story. Like something's got to happen. There's got to be change, right? Always, 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 right? So that beginning hook part is what's the emotional connection? How do I get into your heart and shake it? Now, people might say, well, for B2B, that's a little different. It's not because everyone is like, if they're looking for your product, they're trying to solve a problem, right? So there's a pain there that they're like, gosh, I need to get on Riverside because it's way better than Zoom for recording podcasts, right? I mean, you're searching for a solution. For B2C, it could be a little more spur of the moment. Oh, what a cool T-shirt! I'm just going to buy it. It's $20. Those mad. Kind of like I've got a bunch of mad money. I just want to spend.
Right.
Whatever, right? So first and foremost, beginning hook has to have an emotional appeal. Aristotle called this the pathos, right? And so everything I'm about to tell you, I clearly didn't invent. It's all based on Aristotle and a lot of great work by Joseph Campbell, by the Story Grid, like all these people that have been, Robert McPhee, or yeah, Robert McPhee, all who have analyzed story, Kurt Vonnegut. I mean, these, again, like there's thousands and thousands of years of human evolution. This is just the way it works, right? So, first part, hook them in with emotion. Second part is what is typically called the middle build. The middle build is sort of the progression of how I'm interested and how am I going to logically go from point A to point B. And generally there's some ups and downs, and of course it's a story, so usually there's going to be some um, like complications along the way, right? But typically for B2B storytelling and B2C storytelling, it's how do I solve the problem that hooked me in? So the hook, right? I've got a problem. Oh, you solve it this way. One, two, three. Usually, best way, story brand way, which I love, is like, here's the 3-step process to solve your problem. I mean, this is what Don Miller talks about all the time. He's actually really good at this. And he's actually got a bunch of online tools, which is kind of cool. It's like, oh man, like, I don't feel like I'm an island alone. Jari's wacky stuff. Oh no, smarter people than me. You know what I mean, right? Again, because this is all based on basic story. So the middle build has to sort of say, what's the process I'm going to use to solve my problem? Like, and that's usually what's called the logos or the logic, the step 1, step 2, step 3, typically, right? Like, and it gets like the details, like, oh, this is what the product does, and etc. The ending is usually called the payoff. So we've got the beginning hook, the middle build, and the ending payoff. And this is all, Story Grid, Robert McPhee, all these kind of guys, right? They all basically the same. Um, anyone writing a story kind of gets this, right? But the ending payoff, typically for these kinds of stories, is some sort of credibility, like especially for B2B and even B2C. So I've hooked you in, I've told you how I'm going to solve your problem, and now I have to convince you that I actually can solve your problem. What is the credibility? Now, in a normal story, the payoff is that the hero wins or whatever. What you do is you've paid off whatever the protagonist was trying to go through, like traditionally, like, oh, like in Star Wars, hey, Luke blows up the Death Star. That's the payoff, right? Like, great, he's the hero, yay! But for business storytelling, it's a little bit different. Yet we have to prove to whoever we're talking to that we've actually got the credentials, the bona fides to actually deliver what we just promised in the middle build, right? So you think about it, we hooked you in with emotion. We say, hey, we can solve your problem. This is how we're going to solve your problem. And you should trust us to solve your problem because of this. We're the expert. We know storytelling. We've written a book. Our tool is this. Some statistic, proof. I need proof, right? And then in kind of business storytelling, B2B or B2C, then you have to ask them to do something, right? Like, hey, are you interested? Like what you said. Hey, you want to come on the podcast? I'm like, yeah,
Right.
sure, why not? Sounds good. I like you. You seem to know what you're doing, you know what I mean? So it's all stories have those parts, like generally. But when we come to B2B or B2C storytelling, we are specifically trying to persuade someone to do something. And that's hard to do. People, they don't like to be, it's hard.
Right? It is not easy.
No.
As a marketer,
yeah,
I could say it is not easy.
No, not at all.
So once people start to work this into their way of doing outreach, you mentioned something off the podcast that I really wanted to hear more about. You talked about how you should really always be doing outreach, and it kind of makes me think of that old saying, don't wait till you're hungry to hunt or fish, or however that saying goes. And I wanted you to talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times people start thinking about this stuff when there's a problem, or sales are down or leads are drying up. I mean, we're right now, I would say, in maybe the middle of a recession. If you look at all the metrics in terms of deal flow, lead velocity, just name it. If you look at any of the SaaS statistics, right, they're probably, people aren't meeting their numbers by 30, 35% or something like that. I mean, it's significant, and you can see the layoffs and all that sort of stuff. So what people do, right? Oh my God, we got to be more efficient. Oh my God, how are we're gonna cut down on marketing or whatever, or we need to do more outreach. Well, the problem is, if you're trying to build a solid story, you're also trying to build credibility. You just don't show up right away, and be like, hey, here I am, right? I mean, trust is built over time. And so what and I think the other thing that's really important is that not everyone in your market's ready to buy. I think the statistic that I always use is like 1% of the people are ready to buy at any one time. So, you've got 10,000 people in your quote unquote market. That's 100 people that'll potentially buy, and probably a lot less that are actually buy. But that's a continuum. And it takes time, especially in the B2B space, to nurture them so that they know, like, and trust you, kind of classic marketing. So even if you don't need to quote unquote do outreach, you actually should always be nurturing, always be sending information out, being useful, because you never know where they are in their buying process. They could tell you, but they don't really know. But you have to have this constant, I would say, a constant cadence of just like, here I am, this is what I do, here to help. Hey, if you're interested, and not in a selly way. I think more in, you can do that at times, but I think it's just like generally being useful. And outreach is fantastic for that. Combined with content marketing, combined with thought leadership, combined with being on a podcast, right? I mean, it's like they just know who you are. So when you do reach out, you're not just some rando that's like sending them a cold email. You're like, oh, great. Yeah.
And your emails don't have that same scent of desperation.
Well, and it's fine if there's a certain part of that, but not normally. I mean, I sometimes give the analogy to dating, right? Like, if you're dating, like, no, like if you're desperate, no one's gonna want you. So, people are the same wherever you go, right? It's not too much of a stretch to be like, yeah, don't be desperate. Be useful, be interesting, be fun, be someone that like people can trust. I think that's part of it too. Um, yeah, I think continuous outreach, continuous I mean, that's why I always have this problem with brand building versus demand generation, and leads and performance marketing, which I think honestly is just performance marketing is just sort of lazy marketing, honestly, because once that's arbitraged out, now what? What are you going to not build your brand? I mean, that's like, now what? Oh, I don't know. Well, no, fundamentals are fundamentals, right? Like outreach, brand building, being useful. And I think all that does is get you ready for the opportunity. It's like luck, right? Everyone says, well, I worked really hard. I said, yeah, and also got really lucky because I was at the right place at the right time when the luck struck.
Right. It's, I really hope that people will take this to heart, read the book, and do this sort of thing, because I can't tell you how many times I've been disappointed by somebody who I think, whether it's on LinkedIn or an email, they talk a good game for maybe one email, one in mail. And it's like, oh, yeah, okay, we're really going to build a relationship. Maybe I can help you, you can help me, and we'll just see where this goes. But the next email, it's, did I tell you that I sell something? No, I kind of guessed.
Yeah, it's just not authentic, right? Like I'm not a I mean, I get those all the time on LinkedIn. It drives me crazy. I actually have a section in the book about how to write thoughtful in messages too. And I got it. I mean, I got the idea for that from this guy who wrote a book on communications, and his in-mail message was, "You wanted to be on the pod," and it was like perfect. And he was just like really respectful, and he stroked my ego a little bit, and he's like, "Hey, I just want to know if you need a guest," and he was short and sweet, and boom, done. And I'm like, I appreciate that. And I think this is the thing that's also very important that people should know. Brevity is your friend. You do not want to just vomit up all of the details in the first touch point. Okay. That's exhausting. That's disrespectful to my time. Okay. If I want more, I'll ask. So your job is to literally, when you're doing any outreach, when you're doing any of this, is you want the person on the other side to be like, oh, tell me more. You give them enough information so they can make the decision if they want to hear more from you. That's it. That's all. That's the most powerful thing you can do. And there's 95% of the people don't get that. They just, but they need to know that we're, da, da, da. Like you said, they know we sell. No, they don't. No, they'll ask. We're
It's,
smart.
yeah, it's like those, well, a lot of books that I've read, like fiction books, they just get so into the world building and they tell you all these things. And it's like, you know what? I don't need that much yet. So it's like, give them, the story. You need to know the story so that it's informing the things that you're talking about, but you don't have to give them the full Lord of the Rings trilogy in your first message.
Totally. I mean, it's the same with, again, dating analogy as well. First date, you don't want to tell them everything about you. Then
Right.
there will be no reason for a second date. No, I mean,
That's great. Yeah.
well, but I mean, it's like business dating in one sense. And again, the reason why I use these sort of analogies, and because a lot of people can get that, they know, oh, yeah, yeah, it's not very cool when all I do is talk about myself all day. Maybe I should listen. Huh. Well, how do you apply that to your outreach, your cold email, your sequences? What is it about that? Like, yeah, listen, give the invitation, be useful. I think the best ones I've ever seen on this outreach thing, especially cold outreach, was when someone was like, hey, I noticed this, that, and the other thing. I really like this, but you may want to look at this. Or, even free stuff at sometimes, if done right, is really good. It's like, oh, you're trying to be useful. So think about, yes, you want something from me, but how can you be useful to the other person? If you have that attitude, then generally your stuff's gonna be way more well received. And again, if you have an authentic story, how many times, right? Like, oh, we're the number one, blah blah blah, and we're the cheapest. You're like, okay, right, like everyone else.
I've heard it before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got gray hair and the beard for a reason.
Well, Jari, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely.
I really do hope that people will listen to you and do this. I'm going to be hoping to see some better messages on LinkedIn.
Fingers
Where can
crossed.
people connect with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, right? Just first and last name. Been working on a couple of different things. I've got the story driven series. There's story driven outreach. I've written one called story driven decks on how to build pitch decks, which is another thing that's really horrible if you've ever
Mm-hmm.
been pitched, right? Um, so yeah, and then now I'm really starting to figure out how to pull that all together, and so I'm starting this idea called generally like this thing called story driven. So just literally put the website up this weekend, getstorydriven.com. We're going to put all our books. We're going to build some courses, primarily going to be focused on B2B storytelling because that's what I do for a living. And that's what I think is really, really lacking, I think, in just general resources on that. We're going to do step-by-step stuff. How to actually use Chat GPT and generative AI in a thoughtful way, as opposed to give me an email that says blah. You're like, oh man, like, everyone's doing that. Like, be unique, so.
You're making the world a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Well, so are you. I appreciate being on the show. It's just like really cool you're doing this. Podcasting's like, again, some of the I've had some of the best conversations, so much fun, and you just, it's a great time. So good luck with it.
Well, thank you very much. And everybody check out the website, and we'll have the links so you can find out more and make sure you're up to date with all the story driven universe.